Government officials in Kenya have been known to say some fairly eyebrow-raising stuff, especially on critical national issues. Sometimes we excuse it as politics, and other times we are unable to sweep it under the carpet. After the Garissa University attack, the rhetoric was familiar, with government assuring, promising and making sweeping statements that were simply too far from the reality. Tonight, KTN begins a new segment, On the Record, that raises questions into such utterances. And on the record this evening is Cabinet Secretary Amina Mohamed, who shocked many by claiming the government response to the Garissa attack was adequate. Here's the first episode of On the Record with KTN's Edith Kimani.
It has been 25 days since gunmen stormed the Garissa University College. The events following that attack have been told and retold, each story containing the number 148. That's, of course, the number of people who died. 4 days after the attack, the Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Amina Mohamed, appeared on an international broadcast. And unsurprisingly, a key question was why it took 15 hours to end an attack that was launched by a reported 4 people. This is what she had to say.
The response was adequate, and because of the military garrison that was actually quite close to the university, one cannot actually say that the response was slow.
Adequate. That is the word that she chose, and it is a word which was later heavily quoted all around the world. People could not understand how, given the outcome, the CS could confidently go on record to say the security forces had done a satisfactory job. But listen to this part of that interview where the Foreign Affairs CS goes into more details.
The work began immediately after the attack was reported and continued for a number of hours until we were able to rescue 663 students of the 800 students that had been taken hostage by these terrorists.
Over 600 people saved is by all standards impressive. But if what Amina is saying is correct, that the rescue operation began almost immediately the attack commenced, then why did it take so long to end the siege? And if the response was adequate, why did 148 people lose their lives? Bureaucracy. Now that's the word that we're choosing to use, and one of the possible reasons for that delay. Red tape and hierarchy are blocking communication channels within the police force to a point of hindering effective response by officers. We know from the expose KTN aired a week ago that within the first minutes of the attack, students were fervently calling police on the ground. But how that information gets to the commanding authorities is a long and tedious process, which begins with a simple radio call. Now, the officer who receives a distress call radios a control room. These control rooms are limited to a provincial communication radius. So if a call is made in Garissa, for example, the Nairobi province officers will not have access to that message. In that control room, a duty officer receives the call, and from here, the OCS, who is the person in charge of the police station closest to the scene of distress, is alerted. The OCS then radios his ground teams, who are usually in pre-selected teams, and they're called sectors, which respond to specific crimes. So there might be a sector that deals with carjackings, and in this case, terrorist threats. Now, these sectors cannot move to anyone's calls unless they are ordered to do so. If the threat, as was in Garissa, proves too big, then the county commander is called in. It is the county commander who then gets in touch with the Inspector General of Police. Then the IG calls the Cabinet Secretary for Interior, and they decide what sort of approach will be used. Now, should they agree on an interagency approach involving the military, for example, the CS for Defense is called in, and the CS then informs the Chief of Defense Forces. The CDF will then get in touch with the Army commander at the base closest to the attack to deploy troops. We cannot say for a fact how long that entire process takes, but if you had to go through an average 5 people to get anything done, then chances are it would considerably slow your pace. Now, we also do not know for a fact if the standard operating procedure is used religiously within the police force or if it was in fact used at the time of the attack. What we do know from an officer who was on duty that day in Garissa is that there was confusion from the onset. The officer told us that his sector was called in to respond to the attack, and immediately it was placed under the command of the OCPD. Now, according to our source, the OCPD was reluctant to give the order to have the officers go into the rescue because he felt there were simply too few. At the same time, our source says that the county commander was calling the OCPD from a different location repeatedly to find out why officers had not made their way into the university. The officer told us while the AP commander was directing the teams to move into the university grounds, the OCPD was not for the idea. There were only 11 police officers under their command and poorly equipped. And in the end, the police officers who were ideally the first response line cordoned off the university and engaged the terrorists in a gunfight for several hours before the recce squad based in Roiro, which is kilometers away, arrived at the scene. So let's compare this to the French police response to the Charlie Hebdo attack. The key characteristic of the response was the mobilization of 88,150 personnel, 50,000 policemen, 32,000 gendarmes, these are military police, 5,000 police, mobile police, and 1,150 soldiers. See, after a series of attacks, the French government put in place a centralized alert system, which is called the Vigipirate plan. And it is the architecture of the Vigipirate that allows French police forces to have a harmonized response. So where's our Vigipirate, you might ask? We don't have one, unfortunately. Legislation that would allow this to happen has stalled, and there's been no mention to revive it. And yet,
the response was adequate.
The sad reality is that even if the legislation was in place, capacity and limited resources within the police service would probably be a deterrent. Now, according to Air Wing Commander Rogers Mbidi, the entire National Police Service has only 3 working aircrafts. 1 is under maintenance and 8 are beyond economical repair. Now, these 3 aircrafts are meant to provide air support. They're supposed to conduct border patrols, be there for rapid response and respond to anti-terror in the entire country. 3 aircrafts. There have been efforts to purchase new helicopters, but the tendering process was halted indefinitely, actually just last week, and there are investigations currently ongoing to look into claims of corruption in the procurement of aircrafts and parts, as well as misuse of aircrafts within the service. But that's fine because, well,
the response was adequate.
But wait, there are helicopters at the disposal of other security agencies, so why not use those? Especially since in June of 2014, President Uhuru Kenyatta, through an executive order, placed security personnel and equipment of the Kenya Wildlife Service, the Kenya Forest Service, and the Kenya Prison Service, and the National Youth Service under the command of the Inspector General of Police. Now, it gets even better. The order expressly stated that operations of any aircraft owned by government entities, except the Kenya Defence Forces, will be availed to the Inspector General of Police for the purpose of enhancing the country's ability to combat insecurity. The IG himself, together with the CES, used a KWS chopper to get to Garissa, so we know for a fact that the order is being followed. We're just confused why it didn't apply to the recce squad when they needed transport. But maybe it's okay because
the response was adequate.
Adequate is an adjective that means satisfactory or acceptable in quantity and quality. The response was not adequate because 148 lives were lost. The response was not acceptable because as a country, we really ought to have learned from Westgate and Mpeketoni and Mandera bus attack and the Mandera Quarry attack and the over 100 attacks that Kenya has had since October 16th, 2011. The response was not adequate because parents are burying their children as the government buries its head in the sand. And by the way, the latest response tactic by the government now seems to be to close any institution at the slightest hint of a terror threat. Adequate is simply not enough.